All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive, really fascinating gap between the founding ideals of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, and its modern geopolitical reality. I mean, we are looking at an absolute giant of an international body here. The OIC is second only to the United Nations in sheer size, stretching across 4 continents and representing a huge portion of the global population. But when we put what it was meant to be side by side with how it actually functions today, we uncover this deep systemic paralysis. So we're going to break down the anatomy of that stalemate to figure out exactly why such a potentially powerful bloc so often finds itself totally gridlocked.
Let's start with Section 1, the 1969 Vision of Unity.
To really get it, we have to go back to 1969. That year is absolutely pivotal. The OIC was born as a direct, visceral response to the arson attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The shock of that event, it literally sent ripples across the Islamic world, creating this unprecedented moment of shared outrage and purpose. The charter that came out of that moment emphasized one thing above all else: unity. The goal was sweeping and incredibly ambitious. They wanted to present a totally unified front on the global stage, especially on issues like Palestine, and to build deep economic and cultural cooperation among all its members. At its core, it really was a beautiful vision of global solidarity.
Which brings us to Section 2, the consensus model trap.
Now, despite that grand vision, there's a huge structural catch. The OIC relies entirely on consensus, meaning everyone has to agree, but, and this is a massive but, there are 0 binding enforcement mechanisms. It's not like the European Union, right? The EU has courts and regulatory frameworks holding members accountable. The OIC basically runs on the honor system. It requires unanimous consent, and even if they somehow get it, there's no way to actually enforce the declarations. Imagine trying to get dozens of different countries, each with their own highly specific domestic and foreign policy agendas, to unanimously agree on complex, rapidly changing global crises. When everyone essentially holds a veto, taking decisive action isn't just hard, it becomes an institutional impossibility.
Let's look at the first major hurdle. Section 3, Barrier 1, Sectarian Mistrust.
You can really see how this consensus model falls apart when you look at the fierce geopolitical chess match between Saudi Arabia and Iran. On one side, you've got Saudi Arabia, asserting itself as the undisputed leading Sunni power and leaning on its immense cultural weight as the custodian of Mecca and Medina. On the flip side, you have Iran, firmly positioned as the leading Shia power. But look, this isn't just a theological debate. It is a very real, very physical struggle for dominance. Across Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Bahrain, they're actively funding opposing sides and securing regional influence at the expense of the other. So when the OIC actually sits down to address a crisis, like the catastrophic civil war in Syria, the organization just freezes. It simply cannot act cohesively when its 2 heaviest hitters are fundamentally at odds on the actual battlefield.
Moving beyond theology, we hit Section 4, Barrier 2, Political Rivalries.
Because even without the sectarian split, competing national interests totally shatter any hope for unanimous agreement. I mean, look at the rift that drove the massive 2017 Gulf blockade. You had Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE clashing head-on with Qatar and Turkey, mostly over disagreements surrounding political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. Then you've got completely different points of friction. Take Pakistan, which frequently pushes for unified OIC backing on Kashmir, right? Well, Gulf states often stalled that because they prioritize their massively lucrative economic ties with India. And then throw in the post-Arab Spring splits, where members are deeply divided over whether to preserve traditional governments or back new revolutionary movements. When you layer all these overlapping, competing interests on top of each other, the organization's foundation just splinters.
And that leads us to Section 5, Real-World Consequences. So, what's the actual fallout of all this infighting? Well, because member states are constantly backing opposing sides or protecting vital economic alliances, the OIC is too often reduced to issuing toothless declarations instead of driving real policy change. And this weakness costs lives. Take Palestine, historically the ultimate unifying issue for the OIC. The Abraham Accords recently split the membership straight down the middle between normalizers and fierce rejectionists. Or consider the Uyghur or Rohingya crises. You'll notice OIC statements are frequently delayed or just severely watered down. Why? Simply because many member states outright refuse to jeopardize their infrastructural ties with China. And perhaps most tragically of all, humanitarian responses in places like Syria, Yemen, and Libya are actively undermined because member states are too busy countering each other's influence to coordinate effectively. Without consensus, the OIC's diplomatic muscle just completely atrophies.
Finally, let's wrap things up with Section 6, Framing the OIC's Future.
As we close out this explainer, we're left with some really tough questions. Can the OIC actually insulate severe humanitarian crises from all these political splits? Or is a model built entirely on consensus just fundamentally doomed by the competing sovereignty of its members? First off, could economic interdependence, through major players like the Islamic Development Bank, act as a sort of glue to calm these bitter rivalries? Basically, can shared wealth overcome historic mistrust? Secondly, what about the member states existing outside the intensely polarized Middle Eastern bubble? Could more neutral members, say Indonesia or Malaysia, step up and act as heavy-hitting mediators? And lastly, we just have to question the model itself. Knowing that these nations fiercely guard their own sovereignty, is consensus diplomacy really the only option we have, flaws and all? Can the OIC navigate these deep divides, or will it remain an organization forever defined by a brilliant 1969 vision and a deeply paralyzed modern reality? It's an incredibly high-stakes puzzle, and one that is absolutely going to shape global diplomacy for decades to come.